Ladies and gentlemen, this is internet personality Vangelus, and to kick off covering the limbs of the Bruticus, I'll start near the bottom. This is Brawl, tank by nature, and almost my least favorite Generations Combaticon toy. There's one guy I like even less, but he's besides the point for now. Brawl's vehicle mode is a Cybertronian hover tank with just a touch of H-Tank seasoning and spice, and he works for me from most any seated viewing angle. The edges and pseudo-treads and thrusters are sculpted delightfully, and I can appreciate a throbbing turret like the one seated atop all of that. And if you look at his underside for some demented reason, it's okay. The only major crime being committed is an exposed robot head, but it folds away so much and is so recessed, I hardly ever notice it. Retail Brawl comes in a fairly bright green, a hue that doesn't offend on its own, but grates on me in tandem with the sparse detail paint apps. Like Onslaught, purple linings were the major sacrifice, and Brawl really starves for something to break up the green more than his gunmetal patchwork. While there are no wheels for fake hovering assistance, Brawl's tank mode does have a spinning turret. Also, you can fudge a sort of okay artillery mode out of this guy. It's not intended, not in the instructions, but kinda sorta evokes the imagery of the game. A little bit, maybe. Brawl uses the man folded up under a plate style of transformation, with fairly predictable legs, but a small surprise in how his arms fold down out of his stationary shoulder pads. Also, Brawl's head erupts from his chest way more easily than it looks like it will at first glance. Jumping Jiminy Cricket from the front, something really is happening. There's a robot here! But from the back, there's just an indeterminate splatter of parts hanging down a good inch or two below the comfortable backpack cutoff. 2012's Generation toys suffered from the economic downturn of the era, but nothing feels straight up unfinished, like the globs of technology dribbling down Brawl's back. He looks like a perfectly serviceable robot stuck onto something desperate to feed. Feed. Topping off the bummer is the fairly boring paintwork, which is a real shame as Brawl's got a lot of strong sculpting that is begging for some video game Transformer energy lines. Thank goodness for repro labels, man. His head sculpt is characterful, his handgun is simple yet strong, and while he's slimmed down like the Onslaught toy, Brawl's got elements of a decent toy that are just dragged down by everything around them. Kind of like building a brick house and using Baconese instead of the cement. It's a real good idea at the time, but after a month, it just smells terrible. Ball-jointed head. That's something that Brawl has, and hey, get back up here. It works pretty well. Getting access to it can be a little bit tight because there's a lot of stuff around it, and if you push down on it too hard, it'll, transform for vehicle mode. So you have to be a little careful. Not really full-on kid gloves, just an extra tad of care when you're posing this thing, and it's got a pretty good range of ballular motion, actually. There's tilt, there's nod, there's up-looking. I dig it. His shoulders move forwards and backwards. They're on ball socket connections, but they only really move forwards and backwards. However, for outward shoulder movement, the transformation joint does a pretty good job of it. And I think that if that was intentional, operating within the very diminished budgets of the 2012 Generations toys, it's a decent trick. It accomplishes something useful. He's also got a ball-jointed elbow, and the wrists can, I guess, do that if you're so inclined. Thanks to his limb transformations, he also has a shoulder joint here, which is actually pretty useful and gives a whole lot of life to this guy in terms of his posing potentials. Potentials which are unfortunately stunted by something we'll talk about later on. If you've unlocked it, this joint here in his waist, there is a swivel there, but it's really not for the robot mode, it's for the limb modes, and once you've unlocked it, it's actually kind of hard to keep it locked up there. It'll often come down and start doing that, which is a bummer. He's got ball-jointed hips and thigh swivels, which function quite well and have a good range. His knees have a great range, and his feet can tilt up, and that's a real bad thing because they are held in there with just pins, and they are not very frictional pins, and I've piled a ton of floor polish in there to thicken the connections, and this is the big problem with Brawl. His feet suck. These things fold up for transformation, and they never click down in place. If there was a click down here, this would be a much different story, and Brawl would be much higher on my list. Well, maybe like one spot higher, but that's much to some people. Unfortunately, you have to not only tighten the feet, you have to find very particular balance points and figure out exactly what can be on the ground to get him to stay standing, because that happens all the time. And it doesn't help that he has this gigantic nonsense of ugly on his back, which also pulls him backwards, and he has no heels, he just has these little nubs which I think are supposed to be kind of like heals, but they do not accomplish anything. This guy is awful at holding poses, which is such a shame because he's actually got a decent layout of joints. There is a trick that can help, which is folding down the Bruticus arm mode hands to give him some extra stuff to balance on, but they fold down in a way where when they're flat, they're like this. So you kind of have to fold them down enough to be like sideways, what would you call them? Sideways things, what a brace against the floor. And they help a little bit, but there's nothing in back, and man, it's not surprising that when third-party kits for Bruticus started showing up, at least one of them, the Boosticus set, has things what I believe you can stick on the back of his heels because he needs them so much. Alright, we've picked him up. Let's talk about his build quality. Where do you think this is going to go? It's, well, as far as hollowness goes, there's a lot of hollow in the backs of his legs. There's actually not that much hollow in his arms or his body. I mean, there's a huge panel in the way, but as far as actual build assembly quality goes, this guy is a bummer, and I mean, this is the biggest offender, these things. Now, you're seeing these not flop. That's because, as I said, I piled in thickening agents, and they only just barely hold up his weight now. These things are terrible. A lot of his joints have a bit of flop to them, and it's a little bit of chintz and wiggle, and like this thing up here, it doesn't really, once you unlock it, it never really locks back in place all that well, and that heavily affects the robot mode. It only somewhat affects the arm, or, well, not the leg mode at all, just the arm mode. But this doesn't feel good. This actually feels good, but this doesn't feel good. I don't know. He's got all this stuff on his back. This is flopping around, not locking in anywhere. This stuff is flopping, and this thing doesn't really, it's supposed to clip in, but then, like, another joint starts kind of wiggling. If you wanted to have a great, like, one-shot landmark toy to illustrate everything you might think is wrong with 2012's Transformers releases and their effects and downgrades from the economy, capital T, capital E, Brawl's your man! Well, maybe he's not. Maybe, no, he's your man. Brawl bums me out, man. He's got a fine cyber tank mode, but his robot shows all these hints of promise that get hamstrung at every turn. A decent robot mode with a dysfunctional smear for a backpack, a serviceable suite of posability with ankles so loose he can barely stay upright without modification or mistransformation. And even then, he hardly becomes solid in his stance, he's just able to not fall down when you breathe. Brawl's two limb modes are actually a bit of a saving grace, which I'll discuss when we talk about the Bruticus play pattern. And for all his copious faults, he does at least fit in and look like a part of the unit when set up alongside other Combaticons. But the final toppings of low paintwork and hollow limbs make for a green tank sundae that will do everything it can to not convince anybody on the fence to come to the side of the Bruticus buyers. Anyway, this has been Internet Personality Vangelus, and I've got one more ground-based video game Combaticon on the docket, one that a lot of people tend to give a smile and a nod. To that crowd, I can only say, I'm very sorry.